A major tech firm in Mumbai launches a sparkling new AI tool designed to scan thousands of resumes and pick the top 10 candidates for a software engineering role. On paper, it is a dream come true for the HR team, but 3 months later, they realize that out of 500 hires, not a single woman has been selected for a technical position. The AI didn't have a mean setting. It simply looked at 10 years of historical hiring data, saw that the company had mostly hired men in the past, and decided that being male was a successful trait for the job. This is the core of our problem. In ISO/IEC 42001 terms, this is a failure of AI system impact assessment. Formally, this refers to the process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating the potential consequences of an AI system on individuals and society. In simple words, it means before you hit the go button, you have to ask yourself, who might get hurt by this and how can we prevent it? You have probably seen this at the office, where a new tool is rushed out because it looks flashy, without anyone stopping to look at the shadows it might cast. So, now that we've mastered the concept of identifying those hidden shadows before they become a scandal, you might be wondering how we actually look under the hood of the algorithm to see where the bias is hiding. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is the anatomy of data bias. Think of an AI like a chef in a busy restaurant in Delhi. If that chef is trained only using cookbooks from one specific region that uses a lot of salt, that chef will think that every dish in the world needs 3 cups of salt. The AI is the same. It is a prisoner of its training data. When we talk about bias, we are referring to systematic errors in the algorithm that produce unfair outcomes. Formally, we define this as a deviation from the expected performance due to unrepresentative or skewed training datasets. Simply put, if your input is lopsided, your output will be biased. Let's break this down together. If you are teaching an AI to recognize a qualified candidate, but you only give it data from one university, it learns that qualified equals from that specific university. Everything else is ignored. It is not necessarily malicious, but it is definitely lazy. And that laziness creates unfair barriers for talented people. Stay with me here, because understanding the lazy nature of data is what makes a great auditor. So now that we have mastered how data creates these unfair patterns, you might be wondering how we move from finding the problem to actually fixing the architecture. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is the governance of fairness. Governance is not just a fancy word for rules. It is a protective shield you build around a project. If that tech firm in Mumbai had followed the governance principles of ISO 42001, it would have had a fairness policy in place before the first line of code was written. This policy requires the organization to define what fairness looks like in its specific context. Is it equal opportunity? Is it an equal outcome? Formally, this is the establishment of objectives and risk criteria for the AI system. In simple terms, you have to decide your rules of the road before you start driving. It's like setting a speed limit in a school zone. You don't wait for an accident to decide that driving too fast is a bad idea. When we audit for this, we look for the written documentation that proves the company debated these ethics. We want to see that they asked, how do we ensure our AI represents everyone? If they don't have that documented debate, they don't have governance. So now that we've mastered how to set the rules of the road, you might be wondering how we hold the humans responsible when the machine ignores those rules. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is accountability and transparency. Imagine a situation in a Bangalore financial office where a loan approving AI denies a mortgage to a family. When the family asks why, the clerk says, "I don't know, the computer just said no." That is the exact opposite of transparency. In our world, transparency is the explainability of the system. Formally, the standard requires that stakeholders understand the logic, the intent, and the outcomes of the AI system. In simple words, if you can't explain why your machine did what it did, you shouldn't be using it. Accountability, on the other hand, means there is always a human in the driver's seat. If that hiring AI in Mumbai rejects a candidate, there must be a human recruiter who can override that decision if it feels wrong. You have seen this, right? The computer said so excuse is the biggest red flag in any audit. We need to see that the company has a process where humans can hold the machine accountable. So now that we have mastered the importance of keeping humans in the loop to explain the machine's choices, you might be wondering how we check if this whole system is actually working over the long term. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is monitoring and auditing. Let's go back to our restaurant in Delhi. You don't just open the doors and walk away. You check the kitchen hygiene every day. Monitoring an AI is exactly like that. It is the ongoing process of tracking the AI's performance to ensure it hasn't started drifting into bad habits. Formally, this is performance measurement and monitoring. In simple terms, it means watching the machine's results to see if they stay within the boundaries you set. If the hiring AI was working fine in January but starts rejecting all female candidates again in June, that is drift. You need a dashboard or a report that alerts you the moment the system starts acting up. I remember auditing a company where they had a great AI, but they only checked its results once a year. By the time they checked, the AI had been misfiring for 10 months. That is a failure of monitoring. We need constant real-time awareness. So now that we've mastered the need for constant vigilance, you might be wondering how to turn all these lessons into a culture of constant improvement. Well, that brings us right into our next step, which is the cycle of continual improvement. We have reached the finish line, but in ISO 42001, the finish line is just the start of the next race. Continual improvement is the practice of taking everything we learned, the bias, the transparency gaps, the monitoring failures, and building a better version of our system. Formally, this is the requirement to continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the AI management system. In simple words, it just means you are never done. You learn, you adapt, and you evolve. If you find a bias in your recruitment tool, you don't just turn it off. You fix the data, you update the policy, and you retrain the team. You treat that failure as a gift, a lesson that makes your company stronger than the competition. When you, as a lead auditor, walk into an organization, you aren't looking for perfection. You are looking for that cycle of growth. You are looking for a company that is honest enough to say, we made a mistake, here is how we fixed it, and here is how we are making sure it never happens again. That is the heart of true AI governance. It has been a pleasure walking through this journey with you, and I am confident that you now have the tools to spot the invisible filters and help companies build a fairer, safer future.